You're listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. After the podcast shakeup, I decided that I really needed to create a sense of stability for myself on the podcast. So I decided that I could do this by weaving in at least the major arcana as anchors in my solo episodes until I got through them all, because I just needed some predictability in my life. So this week's anchor is strength, which I find incredibly fitting for the topic of trust, betrayal, and repair. So I often dismiss the strength card because I find it to be pretty boring. And I feel like it lacks depth and meaning beyond the obvious. But something really interesting happened a few days ago, and I kind of want to share that with you all. So I try to watercolor when I can as a form of meditation and self-care. And lately, I've been pulling a card at random to paint, and this week was actually the strength card. So that synchronicity felt really special because it forced me to spend an extended amount of time with the card. So, and when I'm doing watercolor, I typically pull from my tarot vintage deck when I'm doing this. So what I'm recreating or repainting is coming from the traditional Waite-Smith imagery. And as I was sketching out the lion, I realized that his tail is between his legs. And to be honest, I never paid any attention to that detail before because I'm just always so focused on the woman prying the lion's mouth open. So as I'm sitting there, really kind of immersing myself in this card, and paying attention to the body language of the lion too, it just really got me thinking. And I realized that strength is required in order for us to tolerate discomfort. And the true strength shown in this card isn't actually the woman prying the lion's mouth open. It's the lion working through the discomfort and fear of this woman prying its mouth open. So, in order for us to feel a sense of strength, we also need to be familiar with getting to know what it is we are trying to protect ourselves from when we find ourselves in a position of needing to cultivate strength. And if we really sit down and think about, for example, this episode is about betrayal. So if we think about the betrayal that we've experienced, it's often not just the betrayal that is the most important factor to look at. What's also important is looking at the inner fear that the betrayal represents or sheds light on. So this might actually be a really good time to pull a card to see if tarot can help suggest a fear that an experience of a betrayal might reveal for us. So I encourage you to pull alongside me and then reach out and let me know what you end up pulling, because I feel like each card could represent an internal fear that is either personal to you or one that is really shared among the collective. So either send me a DM, an email, or when I announce the episode, share in the comments. I'm really curious to see what you all come up with in terms of a fear that a betrayal may actually shed light on. Ooh, okay. And I got a jumper, so we'll go with that. Ooh. So the Empress. And because it was a jumper, it actually came out reversed. So normally I try to incorporate all aspects of a card these days. So it's not that I don't read reverse. I do. I just try to think of all aspects of a card when it comes out. But I'm kind of liking that the Empress came out reversed. I feel like I kind of want to just sit in that space for a moment because there's a lot here. So this particular card could represent a betrayal especially in regards to infidelity. I think as a clinician, that's the type of betrayal I tend to do the most work with. And so I think that's why I'm probably feeling called to talk about that with the Empress coming out. And so it's interesting. So while like infidelity can be inherently painful, the Empress reversed also highlights the fear associated with that type of betrayal. So fears related to abandonment wounds or fear of rejection and actually even scarcity. When we look at the Empress, we think of a card of abundance and safety and security. So reversed, it could definitely represent this fear of losing everything, this fear of being left alone, this fear of not being good enough or not being able to take care of ourselves or take care of those around us after this betrayal. So often in romantic relationships, we become so intertwined in every aspect of our lives and our partner's lives that we can't even separate one person from the other. So with the Empress traditionally representing themes of abundance, an infidelity could certainly reveal pain and fear associated with that scarcity and fear of losing whatever they've acquired throughout the relationship, and that fear of, well, who am I without this person? And it could also shed light on that overconnectedness or being so intertwined and realizing, wow, I've lost myself in this person and now I feel so betrayed by them. There's almost this sense of paralysis of and impending doom. Like, who am I? What do I do? Where do I go? I see that so often. Betrayal really only exists within the confines of a relationship. And it's difficult because without relationships, we would really cease to exist as a population, because as humans, we need connection with one another in order to thrive and just survive. So when there's been a betrayal in a relationship that is meaningful to us, or trust has been broken in some way, there is usually this intense urge to repair it because it feels incredibly destabilizing, which also feels very much like Empress energy, or this intense urge to run away from it entirely and just cut our losses. You know, I'm thinking of a quote from a neo-Freudian psychoanalyst, Erich Fromm, who has said, quote, "Betrayal is a fundamental breach of the trust that is so essential to the human experience. It's not just a breaking of promises, but a breaking of the emotional bonds that tie us together," end quote. I think this statement really shows that betrayal goes way beyond someone not holding up their end of the bargain or their word. What this quote is saying is that it essentially severs this emotional bond that was created and formed in order to build the relationship that exists, which is why when trust is broken or violated, we feel so destabilized, hurt, lost, and confused. So one of the questions I get asked the most in my practice is, well, how do I regain trust again? And it's honestly a question I always know is coming, and a question that I kind of dread because I know they're not going to like the answer. And the answer is, you have to make a decision to trust again. But the responsibility doesn't just lie on choosing to trust again, because the person who betrayed you must also take accountability and show genuine remorse or guilt for hurting you, especially if there's ever going to be any sort of repair or rebuilding of the relationship and of trust. Often what I see happens, especially in cases of infidelity, is there's this testing period that happens. And this testing period often lasts way longer than either partner anticipates or even realizes. And then the one moment that the betrayer does something that is imperfect or triggers that pain and fear associated with the original betrayal, the accusations begin, and then they feel like all progress has been lost. These situations really feel like essentially a losing battle, because in those moments we forget that progress and healing are not linear, and we desperately want them to be. But the reality is, if we're going to choose to trust someone again, we have to go into it knowing that we will be triggered, that our partner, our friend, our loved one is inevitably going to do something or say something that feels like they've ripped the Band-Aid off before the wound has had any opportunity to heal. And we have to be ready for those moments. And it's in those moments that I really encourage clients to prepare themselves for that, to build up the emotional regulation and communication skills, to tackle that discomfort when they are going to be reminded of that pain or feel triggered and fearful. And this is where I go back to the strength card, because it's in those moments that we have to be willing to work through the discomfort we're feeling if we are actively trying to rebuild and repair a relationship after a betrayal. In this process that I encourage people to embark on when they are wanting to repair a relationship really stems from the work of Pema Chodron, as well as Esther Perel. You'll hear a lot of her influences in what I share when it comes to this. But Pema Chodron specifically her work, When Things Fall Apart, has been instrumental in not only me personally, but also the work I do with my clients. And something that she says is, quote, "Things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think the point is to pass the test or to overcome the problem. But the truth is that things don't really get solved. They come together and they fall apart. Then they come together again and fall apart again. It's just like that. The healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen. Room for grief, for relief, for misery, for joy." End quote. So again, this is where we go back to the strength card, because not only is it our responsibility to create space and be realistic about our expectations in the healing process, it's also the responsibility of the partner who did the betraying to comfort and check in with the other partner, which could be incredibly uncomfortable for them because they're worried, oh, I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to talk about it. Just want to move forward. But asking them, what's happening for you right now, and validating and acknowledging the discomfort and fear that has come up for them is so vital, because that's really when trust is reestablished. In those moments, when your partner sees you actively noticing what they're going through and saying, I'm here with you. Tell me what's happening. I want to hear it, and I want to be able to help you. I feel like I'm just like quoting everybody today. But again, so like this work and the topic of betrayal and healing is so profound. And so my influence comes from so many people in this field. And one of them is Terry Real, and he's a family therapist and author, and he often talks about these types of moments. And he has said, quote, "Repairing trust is not just about saying I'm sorry. It's about understanding the deeper wounds and vulnerabilities that led to the betrayal in the first place," end quote. And I think that's where a lot of us kind of fall flat. It's not just about saying I'm sorry. Repairing trust requires such a deep exploration of not only the root causes of the betrayal, but also an exploration of the relationship in general and of the self. It can't just be a superficial apology. There needs to be an honest examination of the emotional landscape that exists within the relationship and both partners individually, and explore, okay, what path led to the breach of this trust? And it requires us answering certain questions, like what part of this betrayal was because of the relationship landscape, and what part of this betrayal had absolutely nothing to do with the relationship. That type of exploration requires strength in and of itself. It becomes a recipe for disaster when neither partner or person wants to acknowledge or take responsibility for their role in the relationship. And often couples counseling can feel the way the strength card looks, prying open the lion's mouth, trying to get an ounce of vulnerability or accountability or information. Speaking of couples counseling, because I'm so inspired by the work of Esther Perel and what she's done to contribute to this particular field of betrayal and healing relationships, I really love the way she talks about narratives, because I also work from a very narrative approach. And I'm big on helping people own their personal narrative and their life narrative. And something that I think a lot of us forget is that, and actually Esther talks about this, she says something along the lines of, when we experience a betrayal in a relationship, we basically are robbing someone of the story that they've created for themselves. And I think that can be such a compelling lens to look through, and one that the betrayer often forgets about, and one that the betrayed doesn't even think to acknowledge. But the truth is, when something happens to us that kind of shakes the core of our relational foundation, we experience a loss of control and a loss of autonomy. At least we feel like we are, because suddenly we're not the ones writing our love story anymore. We're not the one in charge of the plot. In fact, there's been a plot twist that we never anticipated. And now we're left scrambling, trying to figure out what the hell to do next. It's a dizzying dance, and it requires an incredible amount of patience and empathy, especially once the dust settles a bit and you're kind of just standing there. Speaking of narratives, I recently picked up Tarot of the Abyss, and there's 2 Three of Swords cards in that deck. And it's really making me think of one of the Three of Swords, because in one of the cards, there's this person, and actually I posted this on Instagram recently and asked for everyone's input because it was a depiction that really impacted me. And the image is incredible. It's this person reading from a book with 3 swords stabbed into the middle of the pages, and the person's brain is exposed and letters are flying off the pages. It's a really heart-wrenching image in many ways. And I think it really speaks to this idea of losing the direction our narrative was taking, or having to stop whatever page we were on. And even if we pull those swords out of the book and continue writing, the holes that the swords created are still going to be there. Speaking of the brain, there's a decent amount of research on the neuroscience behind betrayal, which is really exciting. And so, gosh, I'm talking about everyone today, but I have to talk about everyone else's work in this field, because there's been some great contributions. So one of my favorite neuroscientists is Andrew Huberman, and he talks about how there's a specific way that betrayal affects the brain, and how when we are betrayed, it actually activates a part of our brain's threat response system, which then triggers and activates our stress hormones to be released. And once the stress hormones are released, we start to experience an increase in feelings of anger and sadness and fear. So, our brains are wired to respond to betrayal basically as if we were in some form of physical threat, which makes a lot of sense if you think about how we physically respond when we've been betrayed by someone that we love and trust. There is often a really intense physiological experience that we have. So one of the key areas of the brain involved in processing betrayal is called the anterior insula. And there have been several fMRI studies that show that the anterior insula actually becomes incredibly activated when we feel betrayed. And because the anterior insula plays a big role in processing emotional pain and empathy and social rejection, when it's activated, like during an experience of betrayal, it means our brains are firing and responding in ways that are similar to when we are experiencing physical pain. So I think this is really important to understand, especially like the neurological and neurobiological component of betrayal, because when you're working with a couple, or you're working with someone who you've betrayed or that you feel betrayed by, and they're not understanding your reaction, or maybe you're not understanding your reaction, you can say, wait, this is actually a process that I don't have any actual control over. And especially this can be important for couples when you're dealing with a betrayal like infidelity, because sharing the science behind betrayal means that, the partners have a better understanding of, why we're responding to this emotional pain the way we are. And I think it might increase a sense of patience and understanding between folks when we're experiencing sometimes reactions where we feel or appear inconsolable. So I feel like I need to pause and maybe pull some more cards, bring some more cards in, and maybe shift the focus a little bit to, okay, well, what should we do after there's been a betrayal? So we have the initial experience of, something going wrong, trust being broken, a rupture in communication, the physiological, neurological response. So now what? So I'm going to pull a couple cards. One just jumped out. The Seven of Wands. Let's see what else we get. Oh, another one came out. Another one. Okay, the Ace of Wands. All right. 2 wands so far. Interesting. I'll do one more. I'll pull one more. And 4 of Swords. Okay, so this is interesting. So we have 7 of Wands, Ace of Wands, 4 of Swords. And I think I'm just going to read them in the order that they came out. So this actually feels right looking at all of these. I mean, so if we start with the 7 of Wands, this is a card that typically signifies standing your ground, defending your position, your voice, and also a creation of an assertion of our boundaries. So, if we're looking at this through the lens of repairing a relationship, this card might suggest that we start to look at, okay, well, this is what my boundaries were before. They either were clear or they weren't clear. And now I need to reestablish boundaries post-betrayal. And in order to establish boundaries post-betrayal, we're going to have to communicate our needs and expectations pretty clearly. And I think there needs to be some patience here, though, because sometimes after betrayal, we don't even know what our needs or expectations are. And that can be really muddy for a while. So I think it's important to be patient and say, right now, here's what I feel like I'm needing, but please know that that might change next week, in 2 months, or whatever. And if it does change, it is our responsibility to say, hey, my boundaries and expectations have actually changed. Can we have a discussion about it? I think another component to this card could also be the working to overcome challenges. So not only is it an assertion of boundaries, but it's also reminding us to be prepared for conversations that might feel like we are still having to protect ourselves, but still remain confident in our ability to work through these obstacles, to go back to the Strength card. So I think that this is a really realistic card to pull because I think it's often a reflection of how we feel when we've been betrayed. It's like we have to stand on this mountaintop and explain why it hurts so bad, why what you did was wrong, why it broke our trust. So yeah, seven of Wands. I think that's a good card for this. I'm actually really glad to see the Ace of Wands here because it's a really positive card and it tends to be associated with, an inspiration, potentially a new beginning, creative energy. So it's nice to think about the Ace of Wands paired with the Empress that was pulled in the beginning and kind of channeling that creativity, especially when there's been a betrayal and now a new relationship needs to be created. So if we think about the Empress paired with the Ace of Wands and you are wanting to stay and repair whatever relationship that betrayal has existed in, this pairing could be really powerful because it could say, okay, well now, once you've gone through the initial phases of trying to repair and heal and talk about the betrayal, there could potentially be renewed passion and energy, which you could easily channel into the rebuilding process of trust and intimacy. And this is something that's actually a pretty common that I see in my practice, especially after an infidelity. There seems to be 2 camps of couples. Sometimes there's this really heightened, fiery sense of passion and intimacy that gets restored. And not always, but sometimes it does happen. So I think the Ace of Wands showing up here is appropriate. And finally, the 4 of Swords. So typically the 4 of Swords would represent, a period of rest, reflection, recuperation. I think in the context of repairing a relationship after a betrayal, it could be suggesting the importance of One, taking a break from the intensity of the emotions that we are feeling and taking a break from being in constant conflict, especially after, communicating so much about the betrayal. I think it's a call to pause for both parties involved and take time to self-reflect and actually take care of the self. I think it's also a card that is a reminder that when we are in a space of trying to make sense of a betrayal, it is so difficult to find clarity and peace. And I think it's a reminder to be patient that sometimes we might feel so dysregulated and confused, and that can often make the situation worse because we just want to rest and feel like ourselves again. So this is also something interesting about this card that's coming up. And I wish I remember who I heard this from. It actually might have been Esther Perel because, I'm her biggest fan. Gosh, I think it might have been her, but this Four of Swords is really making me think about this technique. There's this idea that when you are arguing with your partner and it's not getting anywhere or voices are being raised, one of you says, okay, we have to go lay down in bed and finish this argument in bed. And it's not what you think. It's just that it's incredibly difficult to be heightened and to yell while you're laying down because it's a position of vulnerability. When we are standing up, we are heavily armored and tense and just ready to go. But when we are laying down, we're vulnerable, we're exposed, we can't just react at a moment's notice. And the Four of Swords is really making me think of that technique right now of, okay, what ways are we communicating that are helpful? And in what ways are we communicating and working through this betrayal that are not? And how can we be creative in a way that allows both of our voices to be heard throughout this situation? And maybe it's a call to try something new because clearly, whatever we've been doing is not working anymore. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok under the handle @TheTarotDiagnosis and join us while we pull daily cards and explore tarot and mental health in between podcast episodes. You can also subscribe to our podcast to make sure that you never miss an episode. If you have a topic or question that you'd like for us to explore on the podcast, you can contact us directly on our website, www.thetarotdiagnosis.com.